opinions expressed in this podcast belong to the speakers and are not reflective of any organization. The content presented here is for general information purposes and should not be construed as advice.
Welcome back to Animal Introspective, the podcast all about animal well-being and the well-being of the people who care for them. We're your hosts. I'm Stephanie.
And I'm Grace, and in today's episodes, we're going to be talking about the difference between all the terms that we're going to use in this podcast, like animal welfare, animal well-being, animal rights. What's the difference, and why does it even matter? So, Stephanie, what is animal welfare?
Yeah, so animal welfare is a science, and it's measurable. So we define it as an animal's collective physical, mental, and emotional states, and those are measured on a continuum from good to poor. So it's really looking at data-driven metrics that we can use to identify where that animal falls on that continuum.
And welfare is an interesting word because when you Google welfare, a lot of things come up about like state government sponsored financial aid, and that's what people think when they hear the word welfare. So talk to me a little bit about animal well-being and why is that different from animal welfare?
Yeah, so well-being kind of started out in the animal world as something that the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, or the AZA, has started looking into as a new terminology for animal welfare, essentially. And that is because, like you said, there's so many kind of negative connotations that can be associated with the word welfare. So they wanted to find something that was really approachable for people and make it something that they could connect with and realize that it really is the good and the bad together, but we're looking at driving that towards good rather than poor well-being.
When I heard about the distinction between animal welfare and animal well-being, I was always like, yeah, that makes sense. I guess some people would think that the word welfare has a poor connotation. Sure, I mean, that's not what I think, but makes sense. But then finally, like one day I was talking to a relative of mine, and I was telling them that I was an animal welfare specialist working at a zoo. And they looked at me with like a facial expression of such confusion because they were like, welfare? I didn't know animals get like welfare checks from like the government. And I was finally like, oh, this is what the AZA is talking about when they mean that people don't have a different perspective of what the word welfare means. So then I finally got it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it seems like this has been something that's growing across all industries, but AZA being in the zoo field has been really driving this because of that exact difference between common public knowledge and the kind of scientific zoo community knowledge. And so they put together this strategic task force for animal well-being in 2023 and came up with this new well-being framework. And that is specifically so that we can talk about well-being and promote the great well-being and welfare concepts that zoos are doing in AZA-accredited facilities and talk about how great those animals' lives are in a framework that makes sense to a lot more people.
And for those who are listening that might not know, the AZA is the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, and it's an accrediting body of zoos in America. There's a bunch of different accrediting bodies throughout the world that work on creating a gold standard of animal care specifically for institutions that are zoos. So not every zoo that you come across is accredited by the AZA in America, but many of the well-known zoos in cities across America are. Like the San Diego Zoo and the Bronx Zoo, normally the zoos that are the well-known attraction of a particular city are usually accredited. But if you're not sure, you can look them up on their website. They'll have information about what accreditations that facility might have.
And not only is the AZA a really great accrediting organization out there for zoos and aquariums, but there are other associations as well, like ZAA, which is the Zoological Association of America. There's also GFAS, which is the Global Federation of Animal Sanctuaries, so they accredit sanctuaries. There's lots of organizations that do accredit zoos and sanctuaries, aquariums in different ways. And the level of criteria that they use is all a little bit different for each one, but they are overall looking to improve the welfare of the animals in those organizations and make sure that everything is cared for to the best of their ability. And just because a zoo or aquarium is not accredited doesn't mean that the animals there necessarily have bad welfare or well-being. It's important to know that every different institution has its own standards of what they do, but having something that's accredited definitely holds it to that higher standard.
Yeah, and that's really important information to keep in mind when you're looking at different institutions that keep or care for animals and you're thinking of supporting them or visiting them. It's good to have that information in the back of your head. So now let's talk about what is animal well-being. We know that the AZA has defined their strategic framework for animal well-being, but how is it different from animal welfare?
So the AZA's strategic framework on animal well-being defines animal well-being as when an animal is happy, healthy, and comfortable. And they're looking at kind of all aspects of that animal's life and really trying to ensure that the organizations are all working together within their staffing and their design and every component of what impacts that animal's daily life.
And so you said the word happy. You said animal well-being is when the animal is comfortable, healthy, and happy. And we know that there's always been a huge discussion about anthropomorphism in animal care. Generally, it's considered, unscientific, unprofessional to reflect human emotions and thoughts and feelings onto non-human species under the pretense of, we don't know how the animal is feeling, and the sense that humans and other species are so distinctly different that it's not good for us to anthropomorphize. And happy seems like a very anthropomorphic word in the traditional sense, maybe coming from a place of previous thoughts and history where, animals maybe don't feel emotions or they don't have affective states.
I think that this is a concept that's starting to change lately. I think that I've heard a lot of different animal welfare professionals who have discussed that while animal care is a science, there's also some implications of an art form coming in where you are able to not only take in the information that you're seeing from the animals, but also interpret that information. And I do think that happiness comes into play when we're talking about animal well-being and how those animals are thriving in their lives. It's easy to look at an animal when you're a trained professional and you know what behaviors that animal would be doing if it was comfortable and happy and relaxed in its environment, and then interpret those behaviors as signs of happiness or discontent or other emotions. I do think there is a little bit of complexity when we try to get really deep into those emotions and be very specific about what that animal might be feeling, or even interpreting why they're feeling something that we may be projecting a bit onto them. But I do think that there is a bit of validity to saying that we can determine if an animal is comfortable and happy based on those states.
And I know that I can tell when my dog is happy. Like when we go on a walk, I can say with some pretty good confidence that I think my dog is happy in that moment. And a lot of pet owners, animal trainers, and other people that interact with animals on a regular basis can probably think of an experience where you can tell that the animals' needs are being met and that they're thriving in that situation. And by proxy, you can describe them as being happy in that moment.
And just like with humans, we wouldn't expect a person to be happy all the time. So we want to make sure that when we're evaluating the well-being or welfare of an animal, we're also taking that into account. It's completely normal to have fluctuations in your emotional state, to have some days where you're more frustrated or upset with something, to have days where you have less energy, but also to have days when you're really happy and have a lot of great things going on. So we want to make sure that there's just a balance, that you're seeing more happy, more good, positive state days than those negative days in order to determine that the welfare of the animal is in a good trend.
And so you just touched on one of the most exciting aspects of animal welfare for me, and that's how do we measure welfare and well-being? How do we measure the state of the animal? How do we assess it? So whether we're talking about animal welfare or well-being, in general, we're talking about very similar things, but I feel like the most important part of it is what tools and what strategies do we use to determine the state of the animal, and from there, how can we take actionable steps to always try to increase the animal's welfare and well-being?
When evaluating an animal's well-being, it's really important to look at a couple of different factors, and two of the big ones that we talk about in general terms are inputs and outputs. So the inputs are everything that go into their lives. So that's a lot of what we all do as animal caretakers in various forms. And then the outputs are what you actually see from the animal. So those might be the behaviors or those interpretations that we're getting from them. So some important inputs that we provide to animals might be things like, what is their diet? How much exercise do they get? What does their living space look like? So if it's a zoo or aquarium animal, what is that habitat like? If it's a pet at home, do they live in a confined space or do they have a lot of extra space to move around in? And if they are in a confined space, how often do they get to get out and exercise? Looking at things like enrichment, which we'll touch on a little bit later, but what items do we provide to those animals in order to keep them engaged and playing and active in their environment, like toys or puzzle feeders. And then also looking at their veterinary care that we provide to them, medications, and just in general, social interaction, availability, and engagement with your animal.
So, like you said, the inputs are what caretakers provide to the animal, and then outputs is what the animals are essentially producing. So, an output could be the animal's body condition, their weight. So, we're providing them with veterinary care and proper nutrition. The output is how is their body responding to the nutrition that we're giving them. Another output could be their specific behaviors that we're doing. So we provide enrichment as an input, but are we seeing the animal actually producing an appropriate behavioral response to the enrichment that we provide? And there's so many more other outputs. There's how are they socially interacting with other animals that they live with or the people that care for them? What is their attitude like? What is their activity level? Are they engaging in sleep in a way that's appropriate for their species and for the season? There's so many different things that we can measure, and not only things that we can observe with our eyes, but also things that we can measure more on like the microscopic scale. So we can take fecal samples, we can take blood samples, samples from their saliva, and we can measure their hormones to see what hormones they are outputting, and measure things like cortisol levels to see a proxy of their stress levels and things like that.
And it's also really important to consider what stage of life the animal's in when we're thinking about all these things. Because if you have a really young animal, their needs and the behaviors and the outputs that you're expecting to see would be very different potentially than a middle-aged animal or an elderly animal. And the same thing on if you're having animals that are breeding or that have young with them, and those considerations will change with that animal over time. And we need to make sure that we're looking at that holistically and we're not kind of narrowing things down too much where we have specific expectations for that animal.
Yeah, you're so right. It's never like a one size fits all type of model, because you have to take in their species and their age, their entire signalment of what this animal is. And I think it's great to think of assessing welfare through more of a holistic lens.
And as we mentioned in the beginning, and as we were talking about emotional states, we have to remember that well-being is on a continuum, and that continuum can change a lot over time. And that's all normal and natural. And we want to see those fluctuations and trends changing, as long as they're going back towards positive states.
Yeah. Do you want to talk a little bit about who is assessing the animal's welfare? From all different fields. So we have experience working in a zoo setting where there's, paid professionals tasked with assessing the animal's welfare. In the AZA, the accrediting body that we talked about, they have a standard where it's required that all the animals receive holistic welfare assessments, and that can be done in a variety of different ways. A lot of times it's keeper reported, so the caretakers that care for the animals will grade certain aspects of the animals, either the inputs or the outputs, however that institution designs their assessment. So that's kind of on the professional level, but there's also on the personal level of animal care of how can different pet owners, whether you have a dog, cat, horses, farm animals, reptiles, birds, how can they assess welfare?
There's so many different ways that an individual owner can look at welfare with their own animal. So it's really easy to take a look at what your animal is doing. You can look up what behaviors they should be doing through a lot of different groups or resources online and find out more about what are natural behaviors for your animal. And then you can just sit there and watch your animal throughout the day and see what it does. And then from there, you can adapt kind of the way that you provide those inputs to that animal. So if you see any behavioral things that you're interested in increasing or changing, you can provide different toys or different activities, maybe some positive reinforcement training sessions that you can do, which is just your basic clicker, treat-based training. And there's so many different ways that you can kind of work with your animal with your own budget and time frame and skill level. But really what you're looking for is that your animal, like we said, is comfortable, is healthy, and is happy. And those are things that I really think that anyone who is used to being around their pet or the animal that they live with and work with can start picking up on just as they spend more time watching them and engaging with them.
Absolutely. And another important aspect of that is tending to an animal's nutritional and medical needs as a pet owner, making sure that you're consulting with a veterinarian for routine medical checkups, consulting with them for nutritional advice. And so as much as you're kind of observing the animal's behavior, also observing the physical outputs that they provide, again, talking about their body conditioning. Are they the correct weight? Are they eating the correct amount of food for their species? And all of that really important stuff.
Sometimes this can feel like a really daunting challenge for a lot of people, especially when they're newer to this idea and this field, and when their resources are limited. So when we think of things like large animal shelters or wildlife rehab facilities or places where the basic day-to-day care of those animals is sometimes something that you're rushing just to get through every single day, it can feel really overwhelming to try to do even more for those animals. But I think it's really important to know that, even just a small step is still really beneficial for an animal. Even just a couple of extra minutes of socialization time with a shelter pet, or providing a little bit of extra enrichment, or feeding their food in a slightly different way so it takes them a bit more time to actually eat it and more natural behaviors to find that food and consume it, can go a really long way to providing these animals with a better state of welfare.
Yeah, and sometimes even more simple things can have huge impacts on an animal's welfare. In the welfare field, we talk a lot about choice and control, and in general, the theory is that an increase in choice increases welfare of an animal. So now it's quite common in animal shelters, like if at a dog shelter, for there to be raised platform beds in every dog kennel, because even that simple act of just adding a piece of furniture gives them one more choice in their life. They can choose whether they want to sleep on the floor or if they want to sleep on a bed. The same can be said if the kennels are constructed in a way that there's an outdoor portion and inside portion. They can choose where they want to spend their time. Also, if there's any sort of visual barriers on like the doors of a kennel, then they can choose if they want to be more hidden from people walking through the hallway, or if they want to choose to try to engage in more social interaction as people walk by them. So those may seem like very simple, basic things, but thinking like that, I think, makes a huge difference in the lives of animals. And try not to be so caught up, because animal welfare can become really complex, as both you and I know. And you can kind of get carried away a little bit with all the theory of it and all the different applications. And there's so many different things that you could do. But sometimes the best solution is the simplest solution.
Yeah, definitely. And I feel like this idea of choice and control in animals kind of transitions into another topic that we wanted to discuss today, which was animal rights and the difference between kind of animal rights movements and the animal rights kind of drive, and what we're talking about with animal welfare and animal well-being.
Within the broader umbrella of animal rights, there are many different factions and philosophies within it, just like with any social movement, ranging from the mainstream to the very radical. So people that support animal rights really don't always agree with each other, and that's an important distinction. Some examples of different philosophies are some believe that animals should have legal representation similar to humans do based upon their sentience. Some movements focus heavily on animal industries and pushing for legislation and social change that reduce suffering and some of the more brutal practices in animal industries. Some philosophies want total liberation of animals where humans do not intervene in the lives of animals in any way. So there's so many different philosophies, and that's why it's so important to do your own research and see which aspects of it you are interested in and want to support, and which ones that you don't necessarily align with.
Absolutely, and that's so important for anything that you do that contributes to or funds any kind of animal activities, and that includes going to zoos or aquariums, animal sanctuaries, where you get your pets at home from. All of those different philosophies are very widely ranged, and so you want to make sure that you do a lot of research, you know what your own personal values are, and that you look into the welfare in general of those animals and their well-being and how they're living their lives, but know that that is on a very wide spectrum depending on, like we said, if the organizations are accredited or what the personal philosophies of owner breeders or other groups are as well. And taking into consideration all these varieties and the way that people think about animal well-being and animal welfare and the actions that they may take to support their beliefs, we really hope that everyone can gain something from our podcast, and we're really trying to connect a little bit with everyone. Our end goal is to spread more information about animal well-being in general, and hope that anyone can take something from what we're saying and be able to apply it to improve the lives of the animals that they care for or that they work with, and also to help support each other in various ways and really add to the animal care community.
Absolutely. So to wrap up this episode, we're again going to talk about what we're curious about this week. So what are you curious about, Stephanie?
Since we're kind of talking a bit about animal emotions, one of the things that I am super curious about right now is people emotions. And I've been really diving more into what all of those little aspects of emotions are. I found this really interesting app that lets you track your emotions on it. So you can actually open it up and there's thousands of emotions and you can like search through them based on the area that your emotions are. So if they're like trending towards happy or towards sad or angry, and then it will let you kind of narrow in on these really specific terms and just learn more about emotions and emotional states. And I found it super fascinating to dive into.
That's really cool. That reminds me of a time where I was a part of a psychology study where it was a training about emotional intelligence, and I had to do this whole training about being more knowledgeable about specific variations in emotions, not just happy and sad, but elated and sorrowful. And it was so cool. And after I did it, I felt so connected with myself. But now, like, I forgot everything that I learned in that training.
But it still had you start thinking about all those different components.
It sure did.
Yeah. What are you curious about right now?
So I went to a plant store the other day, and now I'm super curious about the taxonomy of different plants. Like, I'm not a super knowledgeable plant genius, but it's really interesting for me to see all these variety of plants and see which ones are related to each other and which ones are really distantly related, and seeing like what exact adaptation is similar within that genus, and all of that stuff is really interesting to me.
Wow, that's really interesting. Yeah, I am not a big plant person either. Like, I love looking at plants. I'm not great at taking care of them. But yeah, that's definitely something that I don't know that much about either. So it's a fun thing to dive into.
And with that, thank you so much for listening. If you want to connect with us, you can write us an email or follow our social media accounts. The links are in the description. And please let us know if there's any topic that you're super curious about and that you want us to dive into. So feel free to catch us on the next episode.